"Excuse me, ma'am, but your ticket is invalid. Can I see your passport?" The words cut through the hum of JFK International Airport like a whip. Cassandra Evans, a flight attendant with a perfect bun and an air of authority, stood behind the counter, her eyes locked on the young woman in front of her. Elena James, calm and composed, handed over her passport, confident. It was just a misunderstanding. She had traveled countless times without issue. This was supposed to be no different. But Cassandra's frown deepened, her eyes narrowing as if searching for something, anything wrong. The pause stretched uncomfortably long. The line behind Elena shuffled impatiently, curious eyes darting toward the scene. Then, without warning, Cassandra grabbed the passport with both hands and rip. The tearing sound pierced the terminal. Gasps erupted around them. Cassandra's face remained unreadable as she tossed the torn pieces aside like worthless trash. "Fake passports are a security risk," she muttered, loud enough for the surrounding passengers to hear. Elena's breath caught in her chest. For a split second, her brain refused to process what had just happened. That was her passport, her identity, her proof of who she was, reduced to scraps on the counter. The terminal fell into a stunned silence. Passengers froze mid-step. Conversations died. Even the distant hum of a nearby coffee machine seemed to fade away. A woman clasped her hand over her mouth in shock. A man in line spoke up, his voice rising above the silence. "I saw her passport. It looked real." Tension hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Some onlookers began recording, their phones aimed at the scene. Whispers turned to murmurs as people exchanged knowing glances. Elena's heart pounded. She felt the heat of judgment pressing on her from every angle. Was this really happening? If you've ever faced injustice like this, hit that subscribe button, like this video, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. You won't believe how this story ends. Elena stood frozen, the cold reality of what had just happened settling into her chest like a weight. Around her, murmurs grew louder, and the judgmental stares cut deeper. Her hands clenched at her sides as she fought back the urge to shout in disbelief. But Elena had learned long ago that reacting in anger never worked in her favor. She had lived through enough subtle slights, quiet dismissals, and whispered judgments to know how this game was played. Her entire life had been a masterclass in keeping calm under pressure, and today was no different. No tears, no panic, not here, not now. "Elena James," Cassandra said again, her voice dripping with feigned authority, as though she were scolding a child. "Step aside, please." Her words were deliberate, loud enough to echo through the terminal. Elena didn't move. She wasn't just another passenger. She was a Harvard graduate, a rising tech entrepreneur returning from a global conference in Zurich, where she had just delivered the keynote speech. This trip was supposed to be a victory lap, a celebration of her hard work and persistence. Now, her carefully built world felt like it was crumbling beneath her feet. The flight attendant's eyes swept over her again, cool and calculating, the kind of look Elena had seen far too often in corporate boardrooms. It wasn't just suspicion, it was dismissal. "You don't belong here." Elena had boarded first-class flights before. She had the ticket, the credentials, and the achievements to be standing exactly where she was. Yet somehow, it was never quite enough. There was always someone ready to remind her of her supposed place. And today, that someone was Cassandra. Elena's gaze flicked toward the torn remains of her passport on the counter. Her pulse quickened, not out of fear but out of something deeper, an anger simmering beneath her polished exterior. She had worked too hard, fought too many battles to be dismissed like this. Have you ever been treated unfairly because of someone's assumptions about you? Share your story in the comments below. We want to hear your experiences. As the tension hung thick in the air, Elena drew a deep breath. willing herself to stay composed. She glanced around the terminal, hoping for someone, anyone, to step in and acknowledge the injustice unfolding in front of them. Nothing. Nothing. Passengers gawked and whispered but kept their distance. Even the airline staff, who should have been stepping up to defuse the situation, remained silent, their gazes darting nervously between Elena and Cassandra. For a fleeting moment, Elena considered calling it quits, walking away, and booking a new flight. It would be easier. She could avoid the scene, avoid the risk of escalation, avoid making herself a target for more judgment. But something inside her snapped. Not today, not this time. She straightened her shoulders, her calm gaze locking onto Cassandra's eyes. "I need to speak with your supervisor," she said, her voice steady and unwavering. Cassandra raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "I don't think that's necessary," she replied, crossing her arms. "It's not going to change anything. You're not flying today." Elena took a step closer. "You tore my passport without cause. You falsely accused me. I'd say a supervisor is absolutely necessary." The crowd around them grew more restless. Camera phones stayed up, catching every word. Cassandra's bravado flickered for just a moment, but she quickly recovered, adopting her condescending smile once again. "Wait over there, and I'll see what I can do," she said, gesturing vaguely toward the seating area near the windows. Elena nodded, but as she stepped away, she pulled out her phone. She knew exactly who she needed to call. This wasn't just a mistake. It was a deliberate abuse of power, and someone needed to answer for it. Her thumb hovered over her father's number. Charles James, CEO of the very airline she was standing in. Elena hated calling him for help. She had spent her entire adult life proving that she could stand on her own, refusing to let anyone think she had succeeded because of her family name. But this was different. She pressed call. "Dad," she said, her voice calm despite the storm building inside her. "I need your help." There was a pause on the other end of the line, followed by the steady, reassuring voice of her father. "Elena, what happened?" Elena briefly explained the situation. The torn passport, the false accusation, the humiliating way Cassandra had spoken to her. Her father listened carefully, his silence heavier than words. Finally, he spoke, his tone measured but firm. "Stay right where you are. I'll be there soon." Elena hung up and leaned back in her chair, her heart still racing. Relief washed over her, but it was quickly replaced by a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about making sure no one else had to go through what she had just endured. Meanwhile, Cassandra continued her duties, oblivious to what was unfolding behind the scenes. Her confidence was unshaken, her smug expression a permanent fixture on her face. She didn't notice the whispered conversations between other staff members, the furtive glances in her direction. But Elena did. She watched Cassandra carefully, her mind racing with everything that was about to happen. This wasn't just about a single flight. This was about accountability, and Cassandra was about to learn the hard way that actions have consequences. Cassandra strutted across the terminal like a queen surveying her domain. To her, this was just another routine confrontation. People like Elena didn't belong in her world. Not in first class, not on her flight, not on her watch. Her earlier triumph still lingered in her mind, filling her with a sense of smug satisfaction. She had seen this kind of passenger before, young, successful, and confident, the kind who didn't seem to know their place. Cassandra believed it was her duty to remind them. Elena watched from her seat, her phone still clutched in her hand, her heart a steady drumbeat in her chest. The seconds felt like hours, each tick of the clock amplifying the tension. Passengers continued to steal glances in her direction, their curiosity and judgment plain on their faces. The room hummed with a nervous energy. She didn't mind the stares anymore. Let them watch. Let them see what accountability looks like. It wasn't long before movement caught her eye. Her father, Charles James, strode into the terminal flanked by two senior executives from the airline. His presence commanded immediate attention, his tailored suit and confident stride making it clear that he was not a man to be trifled with. The hum of the terminal died down to a whisper. Passengers straightened, staff froze, and all eyes turned toward him. Even Cassandra's easy confidence faltered the moment she caught sight of him. For a brief second, her face registered confusion, then recognition, and finally, panic. "Cassandra," Charles said, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge. "A word, please." Cassandra's bravado cracked like thin ice. She swallowed hard, her gaze darting between Elena and Charles, realizing far too late that the tables had turned. I was just doing my job, sir," she stammered, taking a step back. "There was a misunderstanding with her passport. I thought it was—" Charles held up a hand, cutting her off. His eyes locked onto hers, sharp and unyielding. "You tore up a valid passport," he said, his tone like a blade slicing through the tension. "You accused my daughter, a paying passenger, of falsifying her documents without any evidence. Is that what you call doing your job?" Cassandra's mouth opened and closed, words failing her. For the first time that day, her confidence was nowhere to be found. Passengers around them whispered in hushed tones, their phones still recording, capturing every second of the unfolding drama. Have you ever witnessed someone abusing their power? Comment below and tell us your story. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more stories like this. Cassandra took a shaky breath, trying to salvage what little was left of her authority. "I didn't realize. I didn't know she was your daughter." Charles raised an eyebrow. "And if she wasn't my daughter, would your actions have been any more acceptable?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswerable. Cassandra's face turned crimson as she realized there was no good answer, no way to justify what she had done. Elena remained silent, her gaze unwavering. She didn't need to say anything. Her father was speaking for her, and he was doing it with a precision that left no room for argument. "I've been in this industry for decades," Charles continued. "I've built this airline on the principles of fairness, respect, and integrity. And what you did just now, that's the exact opposite of everything we stand for." Cassandra looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. Her earlier smugness had completely evaporated, replaced by a growing sense of dread. "I'm truly sorry," she said, her voice trembling. "It won't happen again." Charles nodded, but there was no forgiveness in his expression. "No, it won't. You'll be speaking with her immediately. There's no place in this airline or in this industry for people who abuse their authority and mistreat others." Elena exhaled quietly, a wave of relief washing over her. She glanced at the passengers who had been watching, noticing the small nods of approval and the whispered words of support. Justice was being served, and they all knew it. Cassandra turned on her heel, her head bowed, and walked away without another word, her footsteps heavy with the weight of her mistakes. But it wasn't over. Not yet. Elena knew that Cassandra's actions were just a symptom of something deeper, a culture that had allowed such behavior to thrive. As her father turned to her, his stern expression softened. "Are you okay?" Elena nodded, but the fire in her eyes hadn't dimmed. "I'm fine, but this isn't just about me. How many other people has she treated like this?" Charles gave her a thoughtful look, then nodded in agreement. "You're right. This is bigger than just today. We're going to launch a full investigation. No one should ever have to go through what you did." The promise hung in the air like a beacon of hope, not just for Elena, but for every person who had ever been dismissed, disrespected, or silenced. Elena watched Cassandra retreat, her footsteps slow and unsteady, each step heavier than the last. The woman who had strutted so confidently across the terminal moments earlier now seemed almost small. Gone was the smug arrogance that had made her believe she could tear up someone's identity and walk away unscathed. But Elena knew this wasn't just about Cassandra. For years, people like her had been quietly mistreated, their experiences swept under the rug or dismissed as minor inconveniences. How many others had been humiliated like she was today? How many passengers had their voices silenced because they didn't have a powerful father or proof of their innocence? The injustice burned in Elena's chest, and this time she couldn't let it go. A ripple of tension hung in the air as passengers continued to record the aftermath. Whispered conversations filled the terminal, and Elena could feel their eyes on her. Some looked on with admiration, others with curiosity. Have you ever experienced a moment like this, when you were treated unfairly and had no one to speak up for you? Comment below and share your story. Her father, Charles, remained by her side, calm and composed. His presence was reassuring, but Elena didn't want him to fight this battle alone. She wasn't a child anymore. This was her story, and she was going to make sure it was heard. Turning toward the passengers, Elena lifted her chin. She didn't need to raise her voice. The weight of the moment carried it for her. "This isn't just about me," she said, her voice steady and clear. "It's about every person who's ever been mistreated, overlooked, or told they didn't belong. Today, it happened to me. Tomorrow, it could happen to someone else. This isn't right, and it can't continue." A wave of murmurs swept through the crowd. People began nodding, their eyes wide with recognition and agreement. If you believe in standing up for what's right, hit the subscribe button and like this video. Share it with your friends, because stories like this need to be heard. Charles looked at his daughter with quiet pride. He could see the determination in her eyes, the strength she had found within herself. It reminded him of the way he had once fought to carve out his place in an industry that hadn't always welcomed him. But what came next would be more than just personal justice. "Elena, you've inspired me," Charles said, turning back toward the passengers and staff. "This airline was founded on principles of fairness and integrity, but somewhere along the way, we've lost sight of that. I'm not just going to fix this situation for you. I'm going to ensure no one else ever experiences it again." He paused, scanning the crowd, his voice filled with resolve. "Starting today, we're launching a full investigation into how passengers are treated at every level of this airline. We'll introduce new training programs, implement stricter oversight, and make sure this never happens again." The passengers clapped, their applause growing louder with each passing second. Some cheered, others simply smiled, their faces filled with hope. Elena felt a surge of emotion, her chest tightening as the weight of what had just happened truly sank in. This wasn't just about a torn passport anymore. It was about change, real, tangible change. And it was happening because she had spoken up. Her father turned to her one last time, his expression soft but serious. "Are you ready to go?" Elena nodded. "Yes, but this isn't over." He smiled knowingly. "No, it's not. It's just beginning." As they walked toward the boarding gate, Elena's heart swelled with pride and determination. She had always thought that power came from those in positions of authority, but now she realized that real power came from within, from the courage to stand up for what was right, no matter the consequences. In that moment, she knew she wasn't just a passenger on a flight. She was part of something much bigger. And as they boarded the plane, she glanced back at the terminal one last time. The whispers had stopped. The stares had softened. There was a sense of unity in the air, a shared understanding that something important had just happened. Elena smiled to herself. This was only the beginning. Have you ever witnessed something that felt unfair or unjust? Don't stay silent. Share your story in the comments below. And if this story inspired you, hit the subscribe button and join our community of people who believe in fairness, justice, and standing up for what's right. As they settled into their seats on the plane, Elena's pulse began to slow, but her mind remained sharp. She couldn't shake the image of Cassandra's smug smile, how easily she had dismissed her, how confidently she believed she would get away with it. But this wasn't over. Not yet. Moments later, Elena's phone buzzed. A message popped up from the airline's internal affairs team. We've received additional complaints regarding Cassandra. Please speak with us upon landing. Elena furrowed her brow. Additional complaints. She glanced at her father, who had also just received the message. His eyes met hers, and in that split second, they both understood Cassandra's actions were part of a much larger pattern. Cassandra wasn't just having a bad day. This was who she was. Her father leaned closer, lowering his voice. I think it's time we dig deeper. This investigation might be bigger than we thought. Meanwhile, back at the terminal, Cassandra was oblivious to the storm brewing around her. She moved briskly, overseeing the boarding process, her earlier confidence still intact. I've done my job, she told herself, brushing off the incident with Elena like it was nothing more than a minor hiccup. She didn't realize that her every move was now under scrutiny. Elena and her father spent the next hour reviewing reports from passengers and staff. What they found left them speechless. There were multiple incidents, complaints of discrimination, power abuse, and mistreatment, all pointing to Cassandra. Passengers from diverse backgrounds had consistently reported feeling targeted or harassed. Several employees had described her as hostile and prejudiced, but until now, nothing had been done. But the final piece of evidence was chilling. A former flight attendant named Melanie, who had once worked directly under Cassandra, had come forward with a recording that revealed Cassandra's true nature. In the audio, Cassandra's voice was unmistakable. These people don't belong here. They should stick to their own class, she said with a cruel laugh, her words dripping with disdain. I don't know why they even let them buy first class tickets. Melanie's voice was trembling in the recording as she tried to push back, but Cassandra cut her off. If you can't handle the way things work here, maybe this job isn't for you. Elena felt a chill run down her spine. This wasn't just prejudice. It was intentional, calculated cruelty. Her father tightened his jaw, his eyes hardening. We have everything we need now, he said quietly. The plane landed, and within minutes, Elena and Charles were escorted into a private office at the airport, where the airline's executive team was already waiting. They listened carefully as Charles presented the evidence, playing the damning recording for everyone in the room. The expressions on the executives' faces ranged from shock to disbelief to anger. This is unacceptable, one executive said, shaking his head. She's been representing this airline for years. How did this go unnoticed? Elena leaned forward, her voice steady but firm, because people were too afraid to speak up, but not anymore. The executives nodded in agreement, and the decision was made, swift, decisive, and irreversible. Cassandra was summoned to the office, unaware of what awaited her. When she walked in, her confident stride faltered as she saw the room filled with senior leadership. Elena, she said with a forced smile, her voice laced with fake politeness, I'm surprised to see you again so soon. Elena didn't return the smile. Cassandra, Charles said, standing to face her. We've received serious complaints about your behavior, and after reviewing the evidence, it's clear that your actions go far beyond a simple misunderstanding. You've abused your power, targeted passengers, and violated the core values of this airline. Cassandra's face paled. I don't know what you're talking about, she stammered. This is all a mistake. Charles pressed play on the recording. The room filled with Cassandra's voice, cold, cruel, unmistakable. Her excuses died in her throat. There was no denying it now. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her eyes darting around the room, searching for an escape. "I didn't mean it. It was just a joke." "A joke?" Elena said, her voice rising. "Tearing up someone's passport, humiliating passengers and employees. You've hurt so many people and you think it's a joke." Cassandra opened her mouth to speak, but Charles cut her off. "Enough. Your actions have consequences, Cassandra. You are hereby terminated from this airline, effective immediately. Security will escort you out." Cassandra's eyes filled with panic as two security officers stepped forward. "Please, I didn't mean for it to go this far. I was just following policy." But no one was listening anymore. As the officers guided Cassandra toward the door, Elena watched her go, a strange mix of emotions swirling in her chest: relief, vindication, but also sadness for all the damage Cassandra had caused. It was over. Justice had been served. The executive team turned back to Elena and Charles, their expressions filled with admiration. Elena, one of them, said, "You've not only stood up for yourself, but you've exposed something we all needed to see. Because of you, we can make real changes to ensure this never happens again." Charles placed a hand on his daughter's shoulder. "You did this, Elena. You stood up when it mattered most." And in that moment, Elena realized that she was stronger than she had ever known. Cassandra was gone, but the echoes of her actions lingered. Elena sat quietly in the office, her hands resting on her lap, trying to process what had just happened. The weight of the confrontation was still heavy on her chest, but for the first time all day, she felt lighter, like she had reclaimed something that had been stolen from her. Charles, her father, turned to the executives with a stern expression. "This can't end here," he said. "Cassandra may be gone, but we have a responsibility to make sure this kind of behavior is rooted out for good. We're not just dealing with one bad employee. This is a systemic problem." The executives nodded, exchanging solemn glances. "You're right," one of them said. "We'll initiate a full internal review, starting with staff training and policy changes. This should never happen again." Elena's phone buzzed, interrupting the conversation. It was a text from a former flight attendant, Melanie, who had seen the news of Cassandra's termination spreading online. "Thank you for speaking up. She made my life miserable when I worked under her. I never thought anyone would hold her accountable." A flood of similar messages followed. Former colleagues, passengers, and even complete strangers who had heard about the incident and wanted to share their support. Elena scrolled through the messages, her chest tightening as she read story after story of others who had suffered in silence. Cassandra's actions had affected far more people than she'd imagined, and for years, no one had been able to stop her. But now, the silence was broken. Charles stood beside her, reading over her shoulder. "You've started something, Elena," he said quietly. "This is bigger than just one confrontation at the gate. You've given people the courage to speak up." Elena nodded slowly, the magnitude of the situation dawning on her. "It's not just my story anymore," she said. "It's everyone's story. We need to make sure their voices are heard." Outside the office, word of Cassandra's firing had spread like wildfire. Passengers whispered out what had happened, and airport staff exchanged knowing looks. For many, it felt like justice had finally been served. But for some, it was more than that. It was a turning point. One by one, employees who had worked under Cassandra began coming forward. Michelle, a gate agent, spoke about how Cassandra had targeted her repeatedly, assigning her the worst shifts and berating her in front of customers. David, A junior flight attendant recalled how Cassandra had tried to sabotage his promotion by spreading false rumors about him. Each story painted the same picture, a pattern of manipulation, cruelty, and abuse of power that had gone unchecked for far too long. Back in the executive office, the leadership team listened intently, their expressions grim. Charles leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "We need to act quickly," he said. "This isn't just about protecting our reputation. This is about rebuilding trust with our employees and our passengers." The head of human resources cleared her throat. "We'll start by launching a new diversity and inclusion initiative," she said, "and I suggest bringing in an external consultant to conduct an independent investigation. We need to show that we're serious about change." Charles nodded. "And we'll make those results public," he added. "Transparency is the only way forward." Elena listened, her heart swelling with pride. This was exactly what needed to happen, not just for her, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel small, invisible, or unwelcome. As the meeting wrapped up, one of the executives turned to her with a warm smile. "Elena, would you be willing to be part of this initiative? Your experience and insight could help us make meaningful changes." Elena hesitated for a moment, surprised by the request. But then she nodded, her voice steady. "Of course," she said. "I'd be honored." Walking out of the office, Elena felt a newfound sense of purpose. The airport buzzed around her, passengers rushing to catch their flights, staff moving with quiet efficiency. It was the same place it had always been, but for Elena, everything had changed. She knew that the fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but she also knew that she wasn't alone in this fight anymore. She had her voice, she had her strength, and now she had a platform. As Elena and her father made their way toward the exit, a woman approached them, a fellow passenger who had been watching the entire situation unfold. "Excuse me," the woman said, her eyes filled with emotion. "I just wanted to thank you. What you did today, it was incredible. It's about time someone stood up to people like her." Elena smiled, her heart full. "Thank you," she said. "It's time for a change, and we're just getting started." Charles rested a hand on his daughter's shoulder. "Ready to go?" Elena nodded. She glanced back at the terminal one last time, the hum of conversations and the rolling of suitcases fading into the background. This wasn't just the end of a difficult day. It was the beginning of something much bigger. She turned and walked out, her head held high, ready for whatever came next. Want to see what happens next? Hit that subscribe button, share your thoughts in the comments, and join us for more inspiring stories of courage, resilience, and change. As the story spread beyond the airport walls, its impact rippled far and wide. What began as a personal confrontation turned into a public reckoning. News of Cassandra's dismissal and the internal investigation at Northern Skies Airlines made national headlines. Social media lit up with hashtags like "IAccountability in action" and "You Flying Fair," with thousands of users sharing their own experiences of prejudice and mistreatment in the travel industry. For Elena, it was surreal. Her phone buzzed nonstop with messages from friends, colleagues, and strangers. "You spoke up for all of us," one message read. Another said, "Finally, someone stood their ground." It was overwhelming, but it was also deeply moving. Elena realized her experience wasn't isolated. It was part of a larger story shared by countless others. Among those who reached out was Danielle, a former flight attendant who had worked under Cassandra several years earlier. She sent Elena a voice message filled with emotion. "Thank you," Danielle said, her voice trembling. "I tried to speak up back then, but no one listened. What you did gave me the courage to come forward." That message was just the beginning. More employees began sharing stories of Cassandra's abusive behavior, creating a mosaic of injustice that had gone unchecked for far too long. And then came the most damning revelation. Evidence from Camille, another former employee. Camille, who had resigned quietly after being targeted by Cassandra, had kept an old recording of one of their final encounters. In the recording, Cassandra's voice was unmistakable. "She'll never last," Cassandra said, laughing. "People like her never do. We just need to push her out quietly." The recording was a bombshell. It was clear proof that Cassandra's actions had been intentional, calculated, and cruel. When Elena heard it, her heart sank. All the subtle slights, the dismissive comments, and the outright hostility she had experienced suddenly made sense. This wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a pattern. At the airline's corporate office, the leadership team listened to the recording in stunned silence. When it ended, the room was heavy with unspoken tension. One of the senior executives cleared his throat. "There's no coming back from this," he said. "This has gone beyond one bad employee. It's time we face the deeper issues in our culture." The ripple effect was undeniable. Media outlets picked up the story, and news anchors dissected it in detail. What had begun as a single act of injustice now symbolized something much bigger, a wake-up call for the entire airline industry to confront systemic biases. The airline responded swiftly. Northern Skies announced a new diversity and accountability task force, bringing in external experts to review their policies, overhaul training programs, and provide real-time reporting mechanisms for staff and passengers to raise concerns without fear of retaliation. Elena was invited to join the task force as a key advisor, a role she accepted with a deep sense of responsibility. "We're not just changing the airline," she said in one meeting. "We're setting a standard for what fair treatment should look like across the entire industry." Passengers who had once been silent started coming forward with their own stories of unfair treatment. Their voices were no longer whispers. They were a chorus demanding change. Back in her small apartment that night, Elena sat down at her desk, reading through message after message of support and shared experiences. Some messages came from people she had never met, others from childhood friends who had faced their own struggles. She realized how much bigger this had become. Her thoughts drifted to Camille, Danielle, and the others who had quietly endured so much pain. What would have happened if no one had spoken up? How many more people would have been mistreated or silenced? "Not anymore," Elena whispered to herself. "This stops now." Her journey was far from over, but for the first time, she felt truly empowered. This wasn't just about standing up for herself. It was about changing a broken system and ensuring that no one else had to experience what she did. Have you ever felt unheard or mistreated? Share your story in the comments below. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button and join us for more powerful stories like this. Together, we can be the change. The investigation escalated quickly after Camille's recording surfaced. Northern Skies Airlines was left with no choice but to act decisively. Cassandra, once so confident in her power and untouchability, now found herself facing the consequences of years of unchecked behavior. When the recording was made public, the backlash was immediate and brutal. Media outlets didn't hold back in their coverage, calling out Cassandra's pattern of discrimination. Social media exploded with responses, many from people who had encountered similar mistreatment but never felt brave enough to come forward until now. Cassandra was summoned to a high-level disciplinary hearing. Gone was the arrogance she once carried like armor. For the first time, her voice wavered as she tried to defend her actions. It was just a misunderstanding, she insisted, taken completely out of context. But there was no escape. The evidence spoke louder than any excuse she could muster. Camille's recording, the testimonies of other employees, and the numerous complaints that had been swept under the rug were now impossible to ignore. The decision came swiftly and without hesitation. Cassandra was terminated from her position effective immediately. Furthermore, Northern Skies issued a public apology acknowledging the systemic failures that had allowed her behavior to continue for so long. The airline pledged to implement sweeping reforms, including mandatory diversity training, a stronger employee feedback system, and regular audits to ensure accountability. The consequences didn't stop there. Cassandra's misconduct was referred to the appropriate authorities for further investigation, particularly regarding the destruction of Elena's passport, a serious offense. As the airline distanced itself from Cassandra, they also began reaching out to employees who had been affected by her actions, offering them support and encouraging them to speak openly without fear of retaliation. For Elena, the moment of justice was bittersweet. She had won, not just for herself, but for countless others who had endured similar experiences. But the victory wasn't about seeing Cassandra punished. It was about setting a new standard and creating real change. The media frenzy reached its peak when Elena and Camille were invited to appear on a nationally televised talk show. Sitting under the bright studio lights, Elena felt an overwhelming mix of nerves and pride. The host leaned in, her voice calm but curious. "Elena, you've become a symbol of resilience and strength for so many. What gave you the courage to speak out?" Elena took a deep breath, glancing briefly at Camille beside her. "I didn't plan to become a symbol," she said, her voice steady. "I was just tired of staying silent. I realized that if I didn't speak up, nothing would change. Not for me, not for anyone else. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary." Camille nodded, adding, "There's power in telling the truth. For a long time, I thought my story didn't matter, that it would only cause trouble. But hearing Elena's story gave me the strength to share my own. We all deserve to be treated with dignity, and if we don't speak up, the system will never change." The audience erupted into applause, but Elena wasn't finished. She leaned toward the camera, her eyes focused, her voice filled with conviction. "If you've ever been treated unfairly, whether at work, at school, or anywhere, know that your voice matters. Don't let anyone take your dignity away. Stand up for what's right, even if it feels scary. You're stronger than you think." The message resonated far beyond the studio. A Stand with Elena began trending on social media, inspiring others to share their own stories of resilience and injustice. Thousands of people, strangers from all walks of life, came together in an overwhelming show of solidarity. The ripple effect extended into the corporate world. Other companies, fearing the same kind of scandal, began conducting internal reviews and revising their employee policies. News outlets reported on a sudden surge in workplace discrimination, complaints being addressed rather than ignored. The movement that had started with a torn passport had grown into something far greater, a national conversation about fairness, inclusion, and accountability. Back at Northern Skies, the board of directors worked tirelessly to turn their promises into action. They hired independent consultants to oversee the changes, ensuring that they weren't just issuing empty statements. Every employee, from top executives to entry-level staff, underwent comprehensive training in recognizing and combating unconscious bias. The entire culture of the company began to shift. For the first time, Elena felt hopeful, not just for herself, but for the future. What had once been a painful memory was now a story of transformation and empowerment. As she reflected on the journey, Elena knew she wasn't the same person who had stood trembling at the gate that day. She had found her voice, her strength, and her purpose. This wasn't the end of her story. It was only the beginning. And to everyone watching right now, remember, your voice matters too. Have you ever stood up for what's right, even when it was hard? Share your story in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more inspiring stories like this. Together, we can make a difference. Elena stood on the observation deck of the airport, gazing at the planes taking off and landing. The cool breeze brushed her face, carrying with it a sense of calm she hadn't felt in a long time. Everything about this place, which had once symbolized humiliation and injustice, now felt different, empowering even. She reflected on the whirlwind that had begun with a torn passport and spiraled into something much larger than she ever imagined. In just a matter of weeks, her experience had sparked national attention, ignited conversations in boardrooms, and inspired countless people to speak out. She had become an accidental advocate for change, a symbol of resilience and courage. It was still surreal. Elena never set out to be in the spotlight, and she certainly never expected her story to matter to so many. But it did. Her phone buzzed with notifications, hundreds of messages, emails, and comments from people around the world. Some thanked her for inspiring them to confront their own struggles, while others shared similar stories of discrimination and how they had finally found the courage to take action. Elena's story had done more than expose one person's abuse of power. It had shown a light on a systemic issue that needed to be addressed. It wasn't just about her, or even Cassandra. It was about every person who had ever been overlooked, dismissed, or belittled simply because they didn't fit someone else's idea of who belonged. Standing there, Elena thought back to that moment in the terminal when she had felt so small, so powerless. Now, she understood that her power had been there all along. She just had to reclaim it. Her father's airline had undergone a transformation, but more importantly, so had she. The confident young woman who once stayed silent to avoid conflict had become a force to be reckoned with. She wasn't afraid to use her voice anymore, not for herself and not for others. A soft smile touched her lips as she thought of Camille. They had stayed in close contact since the hearing, becoming each other's support system. Camille was flourishing again, returning to the aviation industry with new confidence and purpose. Together, they had decided to start an advocacy group for airline employees and passengers facing discrimination, offering legal resources and emotional support. The ripple effect of what had happened went far beyond the corporate walls of Northern Skies Airlines. The story had reached lawmakers, advocacy groups, and community leaders who were working toward broader change in the travel industry. The Elena effect, as some reporters had dubbed it, had become synonymous with standing up for dignity and fairness. Her thoughts were interrupted by a voice behind her. "Are you ready?" Camille stood there holding 2 steaming cups of coffee, her expression warm and full of encouragement. "Yeah," Elena said with a nod, taking the coffee. "Let's do this." They were headed to a panel discussion at a national diversity and inclusion summit. It would be the first of many speaking engagements they do together, sharing their experiences and advocating for change. Public speaking had never been Elena's strength, but she had learned that the right words, spoken from the heart, could move mountains. As they made their way through the terminal, Elena couldn't help but notice the difference in how people looked at her now. Not with pity or suspicion, but with respect. Several employees smiled and nodded at her as she passed, their eyes filled with admiration and gratitude. Camille nudged her playfully. "Looks like you've got quite a fan club." Elena chuckled. "I'm not sure I'll ever get used to that." But deep down, she knew this wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about creating a better world, a world where no one would have to endure what she and so many others had faced. A world where respect and fairness were the norm, not exceptions. As they reached the panel room, Elena paused for a moment at the door. She took a deep breath, her eyes scanning the crowd of people waiting inside, fellow travelers, advocates, and industry leaders, all eager to hear what she had to say. "This is just the beginning," she whispered to herself. Stepping onto the stage, Elena felt a wave of calm wash over her. She gripped the microphone, her voice steady and sure. "Thank you for being here today," she began, looking directly at the audience. "I want to tell you a story, not just mine, but one that belongs to so many others. It's a story about courage, about finding your voice when it feels like the world is trying to silence you." The room fell silent, hanging on her every word. Elena spoke from the heart. recounting her journey with honesty and vulnerability. She didn't sugarcoat the difficulties she had faced, but she also shared the lessons she had learned, the importance of standing up for yourself, the power of community, and the belief that change is always possible, even when it feels out of reach. By the time she finished, the room erupted into applause. But Elena wasn't done yet. "Before I leave," she said, her voice ringing clear, "I want to remind you all of one thing. Your voice matters. Don't let anyone take it from you. Stand up, speak out, and demand the respect you deserve. Together, we can change the world, one story at a time." As the crowd rose to its feet in a standing ovation, Elena felt an overwhelming sense of fulfillment. This was what it had all been for. The sleepless nights, the difficult moments, the decision to face her fears head on. She looked at Camille, who nodded with a knowing smile. Yes, this was just the beginning. Did you enjoy this story? Have you ever found your voice when it mattered most? Share your experience in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Together, we can inspire change, one voice at a time.